Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's webinar entitled Trade Wars 2018, How to Avoid Becoming a Casualty. I'm trusting that the technology gods are with us and that everyone has audio and video capability. If you do not, please raise your hand and give me an electronic heads up, and we will have somebody get in contact with you, hopefully to help you out. If not, we're going to begin. I am Venetia Huffman, Vice President and General Manager of CBI, and I will be your moderator today. Joining me are Jessica Lonsdale with CBI, who is graciously providing our administrative and technical support, and our presenter is Ms. Evelyn Suarez with the Suarez Firm. But before I introduce Ms. Suarez, I'd like to cover some housekeeping issues to make today's webinar a success for each of you. Again, please make sure you have computer capability so that you may enjoy both the audio and the video portions of our program. We need to tell you that all participants are muted in order to eliminate any distractions or background noise. However, you do have the capability to pose questions by utilizing the question field on your screen. We are going to try our best to address as many questions as possible at the conclusion of the program. We will not be answering them privately during the program. We also hope that you will take a moment to complete what I promise is a brief survey at the conclusion as well. I believe it consists of about 4 questions, so it should not be too time-consuming for you. We are also going to be offering a recorded version of the presentation, which will be available to all confirmed participants by the end of the week. And also, please take special note that the presenter has included valuable handouts to be utilized as resource materials within your organizations going forward. So now allow me to introduce our esteemed speaker today, Ms. Evelyn Suarez with the Suarez Firm, domiciled in the Washington, D.C. area, provides legal and consulting services to companies engaged in international trade, specializing in areas related to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, anti-corruption, and trade policy. She represents clients before all trade agencies, as well as in litigation before the U.S. Court of International Trade, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and the U.S. Supreme Court. Evelyn shares her experience as a frequent speaker on critical trade topics and through memberships on various governmental, educational, and private sector panels and boards throughout the Mid-Atlantic. We are very fortunate to have Evelyn sharing her extensive knowledge today about this particularly critical trade war topic. So without any further delay, I'd like to transfer the mic over to Evelyn. Evelyn, thank you.
Welcome all, and thank you, Venetia, for giving me the opportunities to speak. There is a lot to talk about today, that's certainly true. I think it's fair to say that we haven't seen such turbulent times in trade for a very long time. That's why the roller coaster theme, let's switch to the first slide, came to mind when I started thinking about the presentation. Jessica, thank you. I'm going to focus first on the trade policy big picture, but not to worry, I will also discuss how the administration's new take on trade policy impacts your business and offer some tips on how not to become a casualty. Are we really embarking in on a trade war, or does President Trump have a master plan to open up global markets for U.S. exporters? After all, he told Chancellor Angela Merkel that he wanted to get rid of customs duties for autos. Yet, at the same time, President Trump is threatening to slap a 20 or 25% tariff on imported cars and car parts. Tariffs on autos and auto parts would have a very significant impact since 20% of the U.S. economy is based upon the automobile sector. So one strategy we see with the new trade policy is to create leverage in dealing with our trading partners. But there may be another strategy involved here. As we approach the midterm elections, it may be about pleasing President Trump's base. President Trump did, after all, promise that he would get rid of those bad trade deals negotiated under past administrations. In fact, the first thing President Trump did do was get rid of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In March of this year, President Trump proclaimed a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports under a provision of law called Section 232. I will talk more about Section 232 later in the presentation. I will explain the statutory provision and how President Trump has used it. I will also talk about the process for seeking product exclusions and also about the retaliation by other countries. There also have been challenges in the U.S. Court of International Trade to the imposition of these duties and the use of the statutory provisions, and there have been challenges at the World Trade Organization. Then we will cover another topic, China, which is a very big topic. On July 6, 2018, in response to an investigation under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, surrounding China's failure to protect intellectual property and its practice of forced technology transfers, President Trump imposed again a 25% tariff on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. A second set of Chinese imports valued at $16 billion is currently being reviewed, and those tariff provisions will be announced soon. And there's more too, with $200 billion of additional tariffs on the line. But in a Squawk Box interview on July 20th, which is very recently, with CNBC's Joe Kernan, President Trump said that he's prepared to put tariffs on all $505 billion of Chinese goods. Thus far, the U.S. has imposed tariffs on just $34 billion worth of Chinese products, and the Chinese have met those with retaliatory duties. I will further explain this tit for tat, and I will also explain Section 301 itself. Finally, I think it's important to talk about NAFTA renegotiation, which has been on its own roller coaster. The negotiations have been rocky, and its future is uncertain. The talks came to a halt in May. However, the negotiations seem to be re-engaging now that the Mexican president has been elected. USTR Ambassador Lighthizer and Mexican Economy Secretary are meeting this week, and it looks like a bilateral with Mexico may be on the offing, maybe leaving Canada for later. The Mexican president has reached out to President Trump with a conciliatory letter expressing his willingness to finish up the renegotiation of NAFTA. We'll discuss all of this and more. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, we have we are seeing a new style of trade policy with this administration, and it looks like we may be engaging in trade wars to reach, to open up markets or to achieve what President Trump wants to achieve. So let's look at, do trade wars succeed? I think President Trump seems to think so. He tweeted on March 2nd of this year, "Trade wars are good and easy to win." That's quite a remarkable tweet. It's hard to forget. A cornerstone of President Trump's argument is premised on the idea that the U.S. needs to address bilateral trade deficits. The administration sees trade deficits as a root cause of our trade problems, in spite of the views of virtually every economist except for Peter Navarro, who serves in the White House. I'll leave it to economists and think tanks, conservative and liberal alike, to explain why trade deficits don't matter. So President Trump also sees tariffs as a way of combating China's unfair trade practices regarding intellectual property violations and forced technology transfers. President Trump is correct that the U.S. and the rest of the world have had problems with the way China engages in global trade. They are definitely skirting the rules. It is not only their IP offenses, but also their overcapacity in steel and aluminum that has been a problem. And the administration is very concerned about China's Made in China 2025 policy. It is President Trump's use of tariffs to address these problems that is raising alarm bells on Capitol Hill and with business. Many say it is not effective and will hurt those it intends to help. It is also questionable under international rules of the game. Again, this is a topic unto itself and could take a lot of time to discuss. Again, for President Trump, he thinks tariffs will give him leverage it gives him the leverage that he thinks he needs to deal with the Chinese and others, including our allies, to negotiate better deals, even if it means short-term pain. That's what the administration is telling nervous farmers in the Midwest. But it was reported yesterday that the administration will extend some $12 billion of aid to farmers impacted by trade disputes. It's no secret that farmers are in red Midwest states that are so important to him for the midterms and beyond. I'll tell you, it's been tough to keep up with all the developments here. But we can say, it's my view, President Trump may be overestimating the leverage that the U.S. may have. With every action, there is a reaction, and we are seeing that from other countries. Countries have brought WTO challenges and struck back with retaliatory tariffs. We will talk about this global response to these policies. I will also talk about how Capitol Hill and U.S. business is reacting. Well, it certainly looks like we are either in a trade war or headed for one. Whether it's easy to win or not remains to be seen. Whether there will be any winners also remains to be seen. We're going to be sending you kind of a very fun, it's amazing to say fun, short video, less than 3.5 minutes, entitled, it was just put in the Washington Post a few hours ago, called Trade Wars. It's actually very cute, but it's also very, very apt and comprehensive. Let's turn to the next slide. Okay, we're going to talk about these two statutory provisions because they are very important, and these are the tools that President Trump has used to impose the tariffs thus far. Let's start with Section 232. What is it? Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 authorizes the Secretary of Commerce to conduct investigations to determine the effects of imports of any article on the national security of the United States. The Secretary's report to the President, which is due within 270 days of initiation, is supposed to focus on whether the importation of the article in question is imported in such quantities or under such circumstances as to threaten to impair the national security. The President can agree or not with the Secretary's recommendations and take action to adjust the imports of an article and its derivatives. Well, there have only been 5 232 investigations in our history. They took place in 1973, 75, 79, and 82 under Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan, and they all involved oil imports. Well, it's under this statutory provision that the President proclaimed the steel and aluminum tariffs and has directed the Secretary of Commerce to investigate auto and auto parts, as well as imports of uranium. Now let's talk about the specifics of the steel and aluminum tariffs, since they have been in effect since March and have impacted so many downstream users. As of June 1st, 2018, all countries of origin, except for Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and South Korea, are subject to the 25% duty on steel, and all countries of origin, except for Argentina, Australia, are subject to the 10% duty on aluminum. Argentina, Brazil, and South Korea are covered by absolute quotas. Australian steel and aluminum continue to remain exempt from both quotas and tariffs as the U.S. and Australia continue to work out the details of a deal. GSP and AGOA eligible goods that are subject to 232 duties or quotas will not receive GSP or AGOA preference. Other trade preferences are available. No drawback is available for steel and aluminum products subject to 232. Products admitted into an FTZ may only be admitted as privileged foreign status, that is, as imported into the zone. Details about the 232 tariffs and quotas can be obtained from CBP's website. We are also including a handout on the 232 tariffs. Originally, Canada and Mexico were exempted because of the pending NAFTA negotiations. The EU was also temporarily exempted, along with Australia, Argentina, South Korea, and Brazil. On March 23rd, South Korea and the United States agreed in principle to a number of changes to the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement called KORUS, including an agreement by South Korea to a product-specific quota equivalent to 70% of its average annual steel export volume to the U.S. from 2015 through 2017. Many importers of Korean steel have reported that they are up to their limits and they don't know what they're going to do for the rest of the year. That was the case yesterday when a gentleman from a company testified at a hearing before the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee on the product exclusion process. And I'll talk about the product exclusion process soon. On May 31st, President Trump signed another proclamation on steel imports, eliminating the exemptions for the EU, Canada, and Mexico. Needless to say, they were not very happy with this treatment. Canada, in particular, viewed being considered as a national security threat to the United States very insulting. The EU doesn't give any sign of backing off to the president's insults and threats. So with this proclamation, the president also provided a mechanism for making product exclusion requests. It is the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce that administers this process, and they have implemented a process for such requests which can be accessed on regulations.gov. And again, my handout details how you can do this. Basically, BIS has a spreadsheet questionnaire that must be completed. The requester should not include any business proprietary or confidential information. I mean, this is very important because the filing will be made public on regulations.gov. But there is a box that one can check if the requester has additional information that is pertinent to their request, and that is also confidential. If the information is considered pertinent by BIS, they will contact the requester. So an exclusion request can be made and may be made by a directly affected party located in the United States. And that means it need not be an importer. Relief from the tariff will only be granted for an article which is determined not to be produced in the United States in a sufficient and reasonably available amount or of a satisfactory quality, or is necessary for national security. Most of them really are based on not being available in a sufficient and reasonably available amount or of a satisfactory quality. I can say from firsthand experience that the process is not easy and that BIS is having difficulty in addressing the voluminous number of requests. I'm not alone in making these observations. As I mentioned before, just yesterday on July 24th, at the hearing before the Trade Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee, Dave Reichert, said that he was concerned that the broken Section 232 product exclusion process has created more red tape and uncertainty for American companies rather than fixing the problems created by broad steel and aluminum tariffs that apply even to our closest allies. So the witnesses described the harm from tariffs that the tariffs are causing them, and they described the problems experienced with the exclusion process. I can tell you that there are a lot of problems with this exclusion process because I've done a lot of them, and one of them is there's no real way of filing rebuttals. So if somebody objects and what they say is incorrect or false, it is very difficult to respond. So it does raise some due process concerns. So overall, there seems to be recognition that 232 tariffs have created a great deal of disruption, especially with our allies, and the process for seeking exclusions have been rife with problems. In the 232 arena, the big impact could be the threatened tariffs on auto and auto parts. It's said that it could hurt the entire auto industry and raise prices for auto and auto parts significantly. Not to mention, the tariffs would be bad for consumers who could pay as much as, maybe $1,800, but they say in some cases as much as $7,000 more for a vehicle, not to mention car repairs because of car parts. And of course, there will be retaliation. The EU has already promised to hit back if the US imposes tariffs on car and car parts. Okay, let's look at 301, the other tariff provision. This is a provision of law that President Trump is using. On July 6th of this year, in response to an investigation under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, surrounding China's failure to protect intellectual property and its practice of forced technology transfers, the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, and it said it would adopt tariffs on an additional $16 billion worth of Chinese goods. These should be announced very soon. These products should be announced very soon. China immediately announced that it would retaliate with tariffs covering 105 categories of products affecting $50 billion worth of Chinese imports of U.S. products to match the U.S. proposal. Beijing has targeted the largest American exports, most notably agricultural products like soybeans, but they've also hit cars and Boeing aircraft. Just by the way, the Chinese, before the tit for tat started, the Chinese had offered to lower their tariff on autos from 25% to 15%. But with the U.S. action imposing tariffs under 301, it raised its duties for cars from the U.S. to 40%. This is at a time now that the rest of the world enjoys the lower 15% duty. That means that BMWs made in South Carolina and Mercedes-Benzes made in Alabama exported to China will be hit with the 40% duty. Okay, so the 301 story continues. On July 10th, the administration released a list of $200 billion worth of Chinese goods set to be hit by a 10% duty, laying out a schedule for public hearing and comments before the tariffs are imposed. USTR will hold a hearing August 20th to the 23rd about the contents of the list. August 30th is the due date for post-hearing rebuttal comments, and the tariffs will not be imposed until after August 30th. So that jives with the prediction that they probably will be announced in September. So USTR Lighthizer justified the tariffs as an appropriate response under the authority of Section 301 to obtain the elimination of China's harmful industrial policies. The Chinese goods on the new tariff list includes products that are a focus of the Made in China 2025 industrial plan, as well as tariff subheadings that stakeholders recommended during the comment period for the tariffs on the $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. Goldman Sachs says that U.S. furniture manufacturers could get hit in the latest $200 billion round of tariffs against the Chinese. Furniture was spared in the first round. Goldman Sachs also says that tools, tires, small appliances, and sporting goods and HVAC might see modest impacts. This round, as I said before, of tariffs should take place in around September. So if you think that you might be affected, I urge you to look at the lists. And the lists are on the website, USTR website, and we can send you links later. What exactly is 301 of the Trade Act of 74? Section 301 authorizes the President to take all appropriate action, including retaliation, to obtain the removal of any act, policy, or practice of a foreign government that violates an international trade agreement. So it's the violation of a trade agreement or is unjustified, unreasonable, or discriminatory and burdens or restricts the U.S. commerce. Usually it involves a market access issue or unfair trade practice in a third country affecting U.S. companies. USTR conducted such a Section 301 investigation into China's violations that I mentioned before. It also brought the WTO case at the same time for these unfair trade practices. So let's look at what are the prospects for this tit for tat. According to David Dollar, a senior fellow at Brookings, it is hard to see the off-ramp right now for this trade spat. The U.S. has announced $250 billion of tariffs on products from China, and China has partially retaliated, and there's probably more to come. Importantly, one thing that is important to note is that there are no high-level negotiations going on between the United States and China to resolve the dispute. Plus, President Trump seems to see this as a winning strategy for the midterm elections. He said he would hit China, and that's exactly what he's doing. And Vice President Pence, speaking in defense of the administration's trade policy, indicated that the administration intends to play hardball, stating that if China refuses to level the playing field and continues to retaliate against American manufacturers and American agriculture, their leaders should know America will not back down, our resolve will never break, and we will keep taking strong action to protect American workers until China changes course. So it certainly looks like the Trump administration means war, and it's not likely to change its China strategy anytime soon. And there's two parts to this, not only the United States, but also China. And Mr. Dollar says it is not likely that that Chinese leadership will cave. The Chinese offer to buy more products from the United States and open more markets, but that's not enough for the Trump administration. Maybe the two countries will negotiate something to save face after the midterms, but it's unlikely that this will happen anytime soon. So, according to Mr. Dollar, the Chinese tariffs are not a big hit for the overall U.S. economy, but it will certainly hit certain sectors. And I guess if you're hit, it's not good for you. It will also hit Boeing and the automotive sector and agriculture. But agriculture, there's obviously yesterday there is somewhat of a bailout for them. I remind you to check the list. Chinese exports to the United States include technologies like smartphones, computers, and tablets, which are manufactured in global value chains. China usually is the final assembler, but parts and components for those products come from countries like Korea and Japan. So there will definitely be collateral damage to these countries from the tariffs. So I think it's time to buckle up for a rough ride on a roller coaster. Let's go to the next slide and talk about NAFTA. Okay, NAFTA. Where are we now and how did we get here? Let's talk about how we started. The renegotiation started August 17th, 2017, not all that long ago, outside of D.C. The original goal was to modernize the then 23-year-old agreement. Everyone agreed that modernization of an old agreement was a good reason for a NAFTA redo. But business was still concerned given President Trump's negative campaign rhetoric about NAFTA. So the mantra around here and elsewhere became do no harm. The original goal was also to finish the negotiations by the end of 2017 because of the Mexican presidential elections, which were to take place July 1st, 2018. Then it was pushed back to the end of March and then to May. The May deadline became important for the current Congress to consider the final agreement under Trade Promotion Authority. The Mexicans now have a new president and no new NAFTA. Let's take a look at the journey thus far. The negotiations opened up to a slow start. There seemed to be a bit of a disconnect between USTR Lighthizer and the other two, Canadian Minister Chrystia Freeland and Mexico Economy Secretary Guajardo. Lighthizer said the agreement needed an overhaul and noted the existence of bilateral trade deficits, and the other two focused on the modernization aspect and how well the agreement worked over the years. So in all, there were 7 rounds from August 2017 till May of 2018, when the formal negotiations came to a halt. We were really on a roller coaster with NAFTA. It was the 4th round where the U.S. tabled what many labeled as poison pill proposals. These included U.S. proposals on a dispute settlement process called ISDS, a consent for the agreement, the auto rule of origin, which contained a domestic U.S. content requirement, proposals on government procurement, all of these proposals that were unacceptable to the Mexicans and the Canadians, and in some cases unacceptable to U.S. business. It was at the 5th round in November 2017 in Mexico City that there was talk that the negotiations might collapse. There were also rumors at this time that President Trump might begin a 180-day withdrawal process. Believe me, there were more law firms in Washington, D.C. researching his authority to do so and what would happen to NAFTA if he did withdraw. Well, it didn't happen. By the 6th round in January 2018, there were only 3 chapters completed, one on SMEs, one on competition, and one on anti-corruption. This is 3 out of 30 needed to be addressed, and this is in January of 2018. At the 7th round, which is the last round, held in Mexico City in the beginning of March, it was reported that half of the chapters were 80 to 90% completed. But once again, there was little progress on the most contentious issues. So it didn't look so good in the 7th round, which was in March. So the auto rule of origin has been, you probably heard about the auto rule of origin. It's been a point of contention from the beginning and throughout the renegotiation. Initially, the U.S. wanted a significant U.S. domestic content, which would sort of defeat the point of a regional trade pact, which would foster regional integration. But then there was talk about imposing wage requirements for Mexico. Just on July 9th, 2018, the various auto industry associations from the United States, Mexico, and Canada called on the 3 countries to resume renegotiation of NAFTA, since Mexico had elected its new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He's referred to as AMLO in Mexico. In March 2018, President Trump once again put NAFTA in the context of trade deficits. I think he's done a lot of tweeting on NAFTA, and I think they are telling. On March 5th, he said, "We have a large trade deficit with Mexico and Canada. NAFTA, which is under renegotiation right now, has been a bad deal from the USA. Massive relocation of companies and jobs." Then he said, "Tariffs on steel and aluminum will only come off if new and fair NAFTA agreement is signed. Also, Canada must treat our farmers much better, highly restrictive. Mexico must do much more on stopping drugs from pouring into the U.S. They have not done what needs to be done. Millions of people addicted and dying." One thing that President Trump has done very well is conflating a lot of issues here. Once again, he showed his intent to use tariffs for leverage. In this case, he attempted to use the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs as leverage in the NAFTA renegotiation. I guess I don't think it worked because both Canada and Mexico have retaliated, but it's not all over yet, and we shall see. Yes, and also I think the countries have learned from the Korea experience, because I don't think it has been all that great for Korea to have agreed to those quotas. Yet, in April, Ambassador Lighthizer told Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas that an agreement would be announced within weeks. He said they were 80% there with Mexico, but had a way to go with Canada, but that didn't happen. In April, President Trump once again said he would kill NAFTA if he wasn't able to negotiate a better deal. He threatened, he threatened to withdraw from the pact throughout the renegotiation. So as recently as April 1st, he said he wanted to, he tweeted that he wanted to stop Mexico's cash cow, which was NAFTA. And on April 5th, he gave a speech in West Virginia where he told the crowd about NAFTA, "Don't rush it, take it nice and easy. There's no rush. We'll get this done right or we'll terminate it." So at the same time, at the very same time, there was talk, and people were hopeful a little bit, that the parties could reach an agreement in principle by mid-May. But this didn't happen, in spite of warnings by Speaker Ryan, who said that he gave them a deadline of May 17th so that this Congress could consider a NAFTA agreement for passage by Congress. He later said they had a little bit more time when they didn't meet the deadline. And as recently as June 1st, President Trump said he wouldn't mind negotiating 2 deals. This seems to be the latest now. So now we have a president at this very late date suggesting 2 bilaterals, one with Canada, one with Mexico, instead of the trilateral agreement that created the regional integration. To add to the confusion, White House Economic Advisor Larry Kudlow said on June 5th, which isn't all that long ago, "You're going to get an agreement on NAFTA by July." It's still July, so maybe it's possible. So by this time, business was getting pretty nervous. For example, the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable, Joshua Bolton, stated on June 5th that Lighthizer was pursuing some negotiating objectives that seemed to be holding up the negotiations, and he's probably referring to the poison pills, and that the positions put forth by the administration were not only opposed by the Canadians and Mexicans, but also opposed by the overwhelming majority of U.S. business. Yikes. So on July 12th, in a July 12th letter to President Trump, which is published on his website on July 22nd this week, Mexican President Obrador called on President Trump to resume NAFTA renegotiations with Canada and Mexico. He warned that a protracted negotiation would reduce investment in the region. The Mexicans have expressed a preference for the agreement to remain trilateral. Bloomberg reported on Monday that Mexico is pushing for a deal by the end of August. So I think the concern is very real because there is a lot of investment from other countries, especially Asia, in North America because of the benefits of NAFTA. Some say that NAFTA negotiations are re-emerging, and that may be the case just as of the last few days. Lighthizer and Guajardo are actually meeting in D.C. tomorrow, but Canadian Minister Chrystia Freeland is not scheduled to participate. So maybe we will have two deals, Mexico now, Canada later. They have thorny issues. The U.S. has thorny issues with Canada on dairy. Some are predicting a trade deal with Mexico mid to late August. And taking a bilateral approach does seem consistent with President Trump's preference for bilateral trade agreements. So, whether we are talking about a bilateral with Mexico or a trilateral, there's still a lot to resolve since the negotiators remain far apart on many key issues, including the auto rule of origin, dispute settlement, whether to have a sunset clause. In addition, Mexican ambassador to the United States, Gutierrez, said on July 17 that any 232 tariffs, which are threatened on auto and auto parts, must be out to conclude a NAFTA agreement. So, I mean, it looks like that President Trump wants to use a leverage, but the Mexicans seem to be drawing a line. And while possible, I think it is highly unlikely that this Congress will consider NAFTA legislation this year. So if we get a renegotiated NAFTA, we need an agreement before we start the TPA process. Whether it's bilateral with Mexico or trilateral, it has to go before Congress. And it's more likely, I think, than not to go before the next Congress. And who knows what their views will be on trade. So NAFTA has really been on a roller coaster ride, maybe you can suggest a name for that roller coaster ride. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, well, we're going to talk about Congress and its role on trade and what they are doing all about this. Well, even just as we speak, many members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, are voicing their concerns about Trump's trade policies, saying that tariffs on foreign goods will ultimately hurt U.S. business, workers, and consumers. And it also hurts U.S. exporters with this retaliation. Just yesterday, when President Trump once again tweeted that tariffs are great after the administration announced its plan of $12 billion in temporary help to help farmers hurt by trade wars, more traditional free trade Republicans voiced outrage. So some have been saying he's offering aid for a bailout for a problem that he had created by his trade wars. So some, like Senator Mike Rounds, he's from South Dakota, Republican for South Dakota, are questioning, what's the strategy? What's the end game here? And what point do we start seeing things move out of the chaotic state that they're in now into where actually we see new trade agreements? Because we haven't seen any new trade agreements. The only thing that's being, Chorus was somewhat renegotiated, and we're talking about renegotiating NAFTA, and we're putting NAFTA in jeopardy, but there have been no free trade agreements negotiated. Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican from Nebraska, blasted the president's policies as going to make it 1928 again. Others who weighed in included Senators Pat Roberts, a Republican from Kansas, John Thune, Rob Portman, and Bob Corker. Once again, traditional free trade Republicans were pitted against a president who has ignored years of Republican orthodoxy on trade, tariffs, and bailouts. Republican lawmakers are expected to meet with the president today after he meets with the European Commission President Juncker. some of the actions that Congress have taken. Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Corker from Tennessee has been spearheading a bipartisan bill to require congressional approval for the imposition of 232 tariffs, but these efforts were blocked. But the Senate was able to pass a non-binding motion to give Congress a greater role in the 232 process. Corker said that this was an important first step, but others criticized the step as rather weak. I do think that the outcry is growing louder each day. For example, Senator Hatch has been quite outspoken, and he's important because he's chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And he's been outspoken that the benefits to the economy from the tax cuts and deregulations would be overridden by these tariffs. He said that tariffs against our allies and partners in Europe, Canada, Mexico, and around the world are already harming American farmers and manufacturers and raising costs for the nation's families. He said, if this continues, our economy will suffer. He also threatened last week to push forward legislation to roll back President Trump's trade authority if the administration does not change course on tariffs. And it really doesn't look like the administration is changing course on tariffs, because as I will mention later, President Trump is very seriously considering imposing 232 tariffs on autos. House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee Chairman Reichert held a hearing yesterday about the 232 product exclusion process. On the announcement of the tariff on Chinese goods, House Ways and Means Chairman Kevin Brady urged the U.S. and China to immediately begin talks to prevent a trade war. That hasn't happened, and we know that they're not talking. In a July 23rd letter to President Trump, a group of bipartisan lawmakers from Washington and Montana are also urging the administration to urgently reach a solution with China. Senator Ron Johnson urged Trump to make a deal using the leverage created by 232 and 301 tariffs to complete trade deals. He said this was preferable to Senate action on the Corker bill to require congressional approval of the 232 tariffs. He said that Trump's trade policy was antithetical to the free market system. I could go on, but I think you get the gist. There is real concern on Capitol Hill, and Congress could possibly step in if they were willing to stand up to the administration. So we're going to do a little, take a look at the Constitution here. Let's take a look at the role of Congress in regard to international trade. It is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that gives the U.S. Congress specific authority over international trade, including powers to impose and collect tariffs and duties and to regulate international commerce. So how did the president get so much power? Over the years, Congress has given the president the power to negotiate tariff reductions with other countries. This made a whole lot of sense. This was much more efficient than the way they used to do things before, when they did it themselves and they had to pass legislation. In 1962, Congress passed a landmark statute, which we all know now, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which gave the president power to negotiate tariff-setting agreements with other countries. This law also permitted a broad national security exception. This is the law that many say President Trump is exploiting to impose tariffs on our allies. So many are raising the question, what can be done to prevent this? Because it is causing harm. So what Congress gives, Congress can take away. For example, Congress can make it more difficult for Trump to impose tariffs on 232 by mandating congressional review of his proposed actions. Or they could more narrowly define national security, so he has less leeway to impose these tariffs. But it gets complicated because we must also remember that President Trump has the power of the presidential veto. So the Congress in '62 gave him this authority, and now he has it. And to change it, they have to be able to sustain a presidential veto. So thus far, we have witnessed a Congress controlled by the GOP as letting President Trump have his way and letting Trump be Trump. Some say out of fear of antagonizing his voter base. But that might be coming to an end. And I think this week is very, very telling with all these meetings and hearings. But only time will tell whether Congress will show some independence and leadership to intervene to save the country and the world from the pain of a trade war. If there was ever a time for Congress to exercise their legislative check, it's now. So there's a second part of what Congress did in terms of trade. With regard to negotiating authority, Congress has given presidents authority under the Trade Act of '74, specific time limit delegations of power, which to enable the president to negotiate free trade agreements. So this was the case with the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities and Accountability Act of 2015, which gives the president trade promotion authority to negotiate new agreements. TPA sets forth a blueprint for the president, really the USTR, to negotiate trade agreements and provides a process for fast-track procedures for legislative approval and a guaranteed up or down vote with no amendments. At the end of the day, U.S. trade agreements must be implemented by domestic legislation. The only trade agreement that is now up for legislative approval would be NAFTA if they complete NAFTA. It's not even up for approval yet. But as I noted before, some of the poison pill proposals made by the U.S. negotiating team are not only unacceptable to Mexico and Canada, but also to the very members of Congress who will need to pass the renegotiated NAFTA to become law. Some are speculating that the president might give a package or a final agreement that's not a bit distasteful to the Congress, but would trigger his withdrawal. So it would be like a take it or leave it approach. We'll see what happens. So let's do the next slide, and we'll talk about business and how they've been reacting to all of this. Many prominent members of the business community have spoken out against these tariffs and President Trump's trade policy. According to Myron Brilliant, Executive Vice President for the Chamber, we're playing Russian roulette with the American economy with the administration's trade policy with China. His comments appeared in the Sunday's Post. The CEO of the Business Roundtable, Joshua Bolton, also expressed concern, stating while the Business Roundtable wasn't surprised about the president delivering on campaign messages of increasing tariffs and improving NAFTA, it was surprised about the use of 232. According to Bolton, there is concern by business leaders that the administration's tactics will undermine the competitiveness of this country. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon said in an interview with CNN last week that the administration was wrong in predicting that there would be no retaliation, and that with another $200 billion in tariffs and the national security thing with cars, this is what he said, the administration may reverse some of the benefits that we are seeing in the economy. This is what he suggested, and I think this is what's interesting. Dimon suggested the president what he should do is work with Mexico, work with Canada, do a TPP, work with our European allies and our Japanese allies, and go to China with a common front. So he's telling the president not to take his unilateral approach, but rather work with our allies. Union Pacific CEO Lance Fritz says Trump's trade policy is on the wrong track, For the U.S. Chamber, trade is becoming a campaign issue in the Washington state race to succeed Representative Dave Reichert, who is the Republican chairman of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. Farmers are deeply concerned about the retaliation not only from China, but also from our allies retaliating on the 232 tariffs. They formed Farmers for Free Trade to explain the importance of global trade to the public, and they're doing a very good job, and you may see them on TV. There are other coalitions, such as the Global Value Chain Coalition, led by the retail industry, and Driving America, led by the automotive sectors. Business has not only shown its displeasure with the administration's trade policy by words, but they've shown it by actions. There are 2 lawsuits challenging 232 tariffs that have been filed in the U.S. Court of International Trade. One is by a American Institute for International Steel, a trade association, and this lawsuit challenges the constitutionality of Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Almost immediately after the imposition of those tariffs, a company called Severstal, which is a Swiss steel company, challenged President's imposition of the duties based on national. They challenged basically his determination that these duties were necessary for national security. The AIIS has asked for a 3-judge panel review, which would mean an appeal would bypass the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and go directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. They also just made a motion for summary judgment, I think yesterday or this week, to declare 232 unconstitutional and to prevent collection of the duties. So if you happen to be an importer of steel, these cases should be of great interest to you. They may be long shots, but who knows? We will talk later about ways to preserve your rights of appeal for the 232 tariffs. Okay, next slide. We'll just quickly go through the reaction from the world, and then we can talk about what you can do. WTO members, Canada, China, the EU, India, Mexico, Norway, and Russia have filed disputes alleging that Trump's use of 232 violates core WTO rules. They have also brought other disputes. In response, the Trump administration says that the WTO cannot mediate dispute complaints regarding national security matters because of the GATT permits the United States to take any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. In other words, the U.S. is arguing that the determination of a national security interest is self-judging, and you cannot look behind the determination. The WTO's dispute settlement process is slow. It can take over a year or more to issue a preliminary ruling. Delays and shortage of experts in the WTO's dispute system could mean that the WTO members may not have recourse to seek dispute retaliation for another 3 years or more. There's another problem with the U.S. blocking appointments to the WTO appellate body. Eventually, they won't have enough judges, with some rotating off and none being appointed. I think that it is fair to say that tensions are high with some of our closest allies. Today, as I mentioned before, President Trump is meeting with European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, and trade is at the top of the list of what they are expected to discuss. Juncker is expected to try to dissuade Trump from further escalation of trade fights, most especially with regard to autos. The Washington Post reported this morning that several of President Trump's senior economic advisors believe he plans to push forward with the 25% tariff on close to $200 billion in foreign-made automobiles later this year. This is exactly what people fear he might do with the results of the 232 report. European officials speaking on the condition of anonymity describe the options that Juncker might be proposing today. He might propose, one option would be to lower tariffs among all major auto exporting countries, while another would be a targeted deal between the U.S. and the EU to eliminate tariffs on industrial products, including cars. Neither of those would be bad things. Let's see what happens. So let's go to the final slide. Okay, so what can you do with all this going on? Believe it or not, there are things that you can do. I think the first thing is to be informed. Check the 232 and 301 lists for imports that are subject to the duties. And then if you're exporting, you'd want to check the list of the other countries, the countries that are retaliating. You want to be informed. You want to speak up. You want to express yourself to your members of Congress, and you want to take advantage of the opportunities to comment on proposed tariffs and rulemakings whenever possible. Especially with, we have the process of commenting on, for example, the 301 tariffs. And then take action when you can. You may be able to take, if these court cases wind up being successful, you might be able to get the benefits of them. You might not have to do this, but you might have to, so you might want to file protest of the liquidations of steel and aluminum, since the statutory provisions and the imposition of these tariffs are being challenged in court. Another thing, there is definitely more scrutiny, and there's been more scrutiny at the border before President Trump. So make sure that your customs compliance is up to snuff. Make sure that you're properly classifying merchandise and that you're properly declaring the right value and the correct country of origin. CBP is looking closer at these things because they do matter. They do matter if the classifications matters for these tariffs, and they also matter for anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders, and there are more of them today than there were before. So there are things that you can do proactively. You can ask for advanced binding rulings. And I think for a variety of reasons, origin is going to become a bigger issue. It is already an issue in anti-dumping and countervailing in a court case involving an anti-dumping order. What happened there was in determining the scope, Commerce actually determined the origin, and it wasn't consistent with CBP's determination. So origin's important these days because we know the origin and classification determinant really are determinative of tariffs. So make sure that you know whether your product is subject to or might be subject to an AD/CVD order. You may wish to ask for a scope ruling because, eventually, the government may take a position that it is, and then you are in a difficult position of arguing that it is not, and you might be subject to penalties, which could be very substantial. And for a product subject to the 232 and 301 duties, you may wish to ask for product exclusions. I discussed the 232 product exclusions a little bit more, but there is a process for asking for exclusions to the 301 tariffs, but it will be administered by USTR. And my paper attachment, the handout that we are including, does discuss that process. So those are some of the things that you might consider doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Very comprehensive presentation, to say the least, and a lot of information we all need to have. We do have a few moments for questions. I want to mention that there are a number of questions specific to commodities and tariffs, and whether or not my specific tariff or my specific commodity is affected by all of this. Those questions are too numerous for us to address today. I would encourage you to contact either Evelyn or myself. Probably with those types of questions, you're welcome to contact me for answers. Or please do use the handouts that Evelyn provided, because they do list specific tariff numbers that are affected by these 232 and 301 implementations. So make sure you utilize those. But you are welcome to inquire with me personally, and I will respond to you. We do have some other questions that will be of interest to all the attendees, I believe. Several questions related to how is my supply chain going to be impacted? How is the enforcement of these tariffs going to affect my supply chain and my costs? So would you care to address that, Evelyn?
Well, I guess maybe the best way to deal with it is to discuss experience with the 232 steel tariffs. You know, for example, you know, if you make something in the United States that you make something in the U.S. with foreign steel and you have to pay a 25% duty, it obviously adds to your costs. And there are other issues if you can't get, whether there's a quota or there's a high duty, but let's say you're getting it from a supplier that is the only supplier of this product. And then maybe that's more so with like a specialty steel than it is with furniture. So, you know, it definitely will add cost, you know, to your, you know, I guess your value chain. And ultimately, you'll have to make some hard decisions on how much you're going to pass on to the consumer.
All right, thank you, Evelyn. The next question is a good one and was asked by several attendees. Do you see this trade war issue being resolved in the coming months, or will this promote further isolation of the U.S., and is this the new normal that businesses may expect?
I don't think that the administration is going to change its policies. The only way that it'll stop is if Congress steps in. And I don't think it's an easy thing because, as I mentioned, you know, for example, with 232, the president can override their congressional action. So far, as I said, that there's been an outcry by the Congress is increasingly voicing its concern. The question is whether it will do something. Business is also very concerned, as you heard in my presentation. And then finally, you know, our trading partners are retaliating. So I don't think that, if anything, I think President Trump is on course to impose tariffs on cars and car parts. Maybe his strategy, his way of making a deal will work, and the rest of the world will back off. But I don't think so, because I think they see this as a very dangerous thing. So, so the answer to your question, and then even with China, you know, as David Dollar said, he doesn't see the Chinese as backing off. So I think you should not expect this to end anytime soon. And you know, even if it were to end, undoing all of this is a big mess.
Yeah, big mess indeed. Thank you again, Evelyn. There's a question that's popped up, which I'm fully able to answer. We buy engines from a factory in Japan through a distributor in China. The product is transferred in Hong Kong, but is in a sealed container. Should we be subject to the tariffs? That is a country of origin question, which interestingly enough, Evelyn did address in her last slide about be concerned with country of origin. So if you have a Japanese product that transits through China, you're safe because the country of origin is not changed. You buy it in Japan, but you ship it in a sealed container. It just happens to get transferred in Hong Kong. So buying and sourcing from Japan is a good option for you.
Yeah, but, be prepared for questions.
Yes, you mean from customs?
Yes, right.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's quite true. Evelyn, a caller wants to know, what is your opinion on the August hearing, and do you personally think this proposal of the next round of billions of tariffs will pass?
I think it's expected that tariffs will be imposed in September.
Not
Right,
news.
right. That they'll have these hearings, and there might be some tweaking of the items on the list. So it's worthwhile participating or submitting comments if you have an interest, because maybe you get your product off the list, because people did do that. But I think it's widely expected that there will be this 10% tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. In addition, even Trump has actually said, in that interview, that Squawk Box interview, that he'd like to hit all $505 billion worth of Chinese imports with tariffs. So he seems, I guess unless he got what he wanted, unless it gave him the leverage to get them to agree, and I don't know how tariffs get the results you want on IP violations, what I'm saying, and technology, forced technology transfers. I don't know why tariffs are, are an effective tool with those kinds of problems. Tariffs might be an effective tool, getting concessions, tariff concessions, or some other types of concessions, let's say in NAFTA or with the Europeans on car tariffs. But it doesn't seem to make sense with the Chinese and the problem, the root problem.
Another good question here. How will this affect, I presume that the caller means the tariffs, how will these tariffs affect finished goods imported from countries that contain components only subject to the tariffs?
It doesn't affect components. I mean, it doesn't affect final products that have components. You have to look at the tariff, the items that are listed. Those are the products that are covered by the tariffs. So it doesn't, and in fact, with, let's say, the 232 steel tariffs, for example, if let's say, European manufacturer made the same thing that a U.S. manufacturer made with the same steel, the European manufacturer could ship the finished product to the United States without the tariff. Yet the U.S. manufacturer would have to pay the duty on the steel. So the European manufacturer would avoid the 232 steel tariff, but the U.S. manufacturer would not avoid it, would have to pay it. So it would be at a competitive disadvantage. So some say that in some cases that will encourage manufacturing abroad.
All right, thank you so much. Another question that Evelyn has addressed, but I want to emphasize, is how to pursue an exemption. Make sure you understand the process by going on the website, and she did provide a handout for that purpose, so read about the exemption procedure. Next question, we produce in Mexico under an IMEX status. Raw materials come in from China into the U.S. and cross over into Mexico. How can the U.S. tariffs be avoided?
Okay, so you import, I'm not sure, you import something, what was it?
Yeah, I'll reiterate that. We produce in Mexico under an IMEX status. Raw materials come in from China into the U.S. and cross over into Mexico, I presume just transit without ever being cleared. How can U.S. tariffs be avoided?
Well, if you're not entering the customs territory of the United States and it's in transit, then you wouldn't pay the duties.
Right. The caller doesn't say that. I'm making that presumption, so hopefully we've answered that correctly. Next question. Have the 25% taxes already begun for those applicable products within a country of origin, China?
The 25% duty applies to the tariff lines identified for the $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. And we should hear very shortly on the additional $16 billion, what's the list for the $16 billion of Chinese
That's
goods.
after the August hearing, correct?
No, I think that's momentarily.
Oh, okay.
There's the $200 billion, which is the subject of the August hearing, and it's not a 25% tariff, it's a 10% tariff.
All right, next question. How likely do you think they are to shift tariffs to respond to Chinese manufacturing shifting from China to, say, Vietnam, for example, or other APAC countries? I guess so they will know that people will be manufacturing in other countries. So is there a possibility that these tariffs will shift to other manufacturing sectors?
Well, I think that's where origin comes into play. Are they really shifting manufacturing, or is it, because we have global value chains, and the question is, that's when I think origin becomes a very important question. So if you're shifting total manufacturing to another country, you wouldn't be subject to the 301 duties. But if you're talking about steel or aluminum, that covers the whole world, except for the countries that agreed to quotas, because I don't think there's any exemptions for any countries except for the ones who agreed to quotas.
We have time for about 2 more questions for Evelyn, so we'll try to speed through this. We are a U.S. company that manufactures in China. How will that affect the tariffs, and does this increase the probability of having containers pulled for examination? It's a good question.
I was thinking about that. If customs is familiar with your company and what you import and what they have confidence that what you're importing is what you're saying you're importing, then I think, you're going to be paying the duties, so there shouldn't be a problem.
As long as they're familiar with you as an importer and know that you're not trying to evade.
Right. Right. If you're producing in China and you're subject to the duties and you pay the duties, why are they going to scrutinize you anymore? You've paid the duties.
Yeah.
But what might raise concern is all of a sudden if you shift, like you have a different country of origin, or if you have a different classification, and it looks like you're trying to evade the duties.
Yeah.
So that's why, this is not amateur hour. It's time to really make sure you are, and what I was saying about customs compliance, it's more than that. If you don't want to raise red flags. If there are changes, that might raise red flags.
Thank you, Evelyn. And we'll take one last question before we conclude. And this is obviously from either a freight forwarder or a customs broker. How best do we advise importers on the tariffs which affect them? So that's a very good question for us as advisors and third parties to this.
Well, the tariff will be modified. The U.S. ITC will be busy making notations in the tariff indicating which tariff provisions are subject to these various duties. So I think it's part of, I think you will know by looking at the HTS-US.
Okay. I think we need to conclude at this point. I want to thank everyone for participating. Again, we will have a recorded version of this presentation, which we will send to the confirmed registrants. The handouts, again, please take advantage of those. And if you have any questions, you may certainly utilize our emails. As you see on the last screen, and I'm sure Evelyn would be happy to entertain any questions as I would going forward. And thank you again.
And we'd like to send you that really short video because it's really fun. It's almost like a game of trade wars. It's less
Yeah,
than
I'm sorry, we will include the video as well.
Yeah, it's 3.5 minutes, but it really succinctly tells you what's going on.
All right, thank you again, Evelyn, and thank you, participants.
Thank you, Venetia, and thank you, Jessica, and thank you all for participating and even going over. Thank you. Bye-bye.